Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. My name is Victoria Hatchell. I am the Special Collections and Archives Librarian here at Thayer Memorial Library. And today we are going to talk about everybody's favorite monarch, George III, and the Lancaster residents who remained loyal to him during the American Revolution. I've packed a lot of information into this program to try to give as comprehensive or a brief overview as much as I could, but it's by no means comprehensive, so I encourage you all to go, do your own research, read books, that sort of thing. So first, we'll start with the three questions I hope to address, which are what the heck is a Tory and what the heck is a Whig, who the heck was King George III, and what were the opinions of the people. If you can walk away from here knowing the answers to those three questions, I will consider that I did a good job. So Tories and Whigs. I usually go by Tory, not the same thing. So both of these terms encompass a long and complicated history when it comes to British politics. So I'm going to give context for the terms based on the late 18th century. The Tories and Whigs were the two main political factions in Great Britain at the time of the American Revolution. Tories were what would one day become the Conservative Party. They believed in the divine right of kings, or the belief that the monarch's authority came directly from God. They were pretty exclusively made up of landed aristocracy, and overall you could say they were pretty anti-reform. American colonists who remained loyal to the king were often referred to as Tories in a derogatory manner, although they were sometimes called loyalist as well. And so the two terms are kind of used interchangeably. Whigs, on the other hand, were what would one day become the Liberal Party. They supported constitutional monarchism and were in favor of a strong parliamentary government. Their members were not only landed aristocrats, but also wealthy merchants, and overall they were pro-reform. Initially, American colonists who pushed for reform called themselves Whig in alliance with the opposition to Lord North's government, but as they turned more toward independence, they began referring to themselves as patriots. So first question, in the context of the American Revolution, who do you think would have supported or been sympathetic to the American colonists? Yes, very good. Overall, the Whigs were sympathetic to America's complaints and believed that they should have representation in Parliament, as was their constitutional right as British citizens. Tories, on the other hand, don't really like reform and would rather those pesky Americans stay out of Parliament. Second question, which party do you think was in control during the time of the American Revolution? So during the majority of the American Revolution and even the years leading up to it, the Tories were the majority in Parliament and were therefore in charge of the British government. The Prime Minister was the man you see here, Frederick North, 2nd Earl of Guildford, or more commonly known as Lord North, but I'm going to call him Freddie. Freddie was Prime Minister of Great Britain from 1770 to 1782, right up until the end of the Revolution. He had been the one in 1773 to propose the Intolerable Acts, which were meant to punish the American colonies, primarily Massachusetts, for the Boston Tea Party. The leader of the Whigs at this time, even though they were the minority, was Charles Watson Wentworth, 2nd Marquess of Rockingham. I'm going to call him Charlie. Charlie was Prime Minister of Great Britain before Lord North from 1765 to 1766, and would later become Prime Minister again when Lord North was forced to resign his position after a vote of no confidence by Parliament. Charlie here was immediately pushed for Parliament to acknowledge the independence of the United States, and as he had been against the war from the onset and was an important supporter of constitutional rights for colonists. In February of 1771, he wrote to a fellow Whig, Edmund Burke, that I fear indeed the future struggles of the people in defense of their constitutional rights will grow weaker and weaker. It is much too probable that the power and influence of the crown will increase rapidly. We live at the period when, for the first time since the Glorious Revolution, the power and influence of the crown is held out as the main and chief and only support of government. If we do not exert now, we may accelerate the abject state to which the Constitution may be reduced. So he very much supported the colonists. And so now we kind of have a very basic understanding of the leaders on both sides, so Tories and Whigs. But there's a third person in a constitutional monarchy that we need. Who is that? George. Georgie. The man we know as George III was born George William Frederick on June 4th, 1738. He became King of Great Britain and Ireland on October 25th, 1760, and reigned for 59 years, 96 days before he passed away at the age of 81 years and 239 days on January 29th, 1820. Only Victoria and Elizabeth II lived and reigned longer than he did, and so that makes him the longest-lived British king, which is kind of cool. George inherited the throne from his predecessor, George II, who was not his father, but his grandfather. His father was Frederick, Prince of Wales, and he was estranged from his father, George II, largely due to being born and raised in Hanover, which is modern-day Germany, while his parents went to Britain due to his father becoming first in line to the British throne. Frederick was 7 when his parents left for Britain, and he would not see them again until he moved to Great Britain in 1728 after his father became king 14 years later. Frederick, however, became Prince of Wales in 1729, despite George II's dislike of him, and he remained so until his death in 1751 at the age of 44 after suffering a pulmonary embolism that may have resulted from getting hit too hard by a tennis ball. Frederick had 9 children at the time of his death, none of whom George II was particularly interested in, but young George became heir apparent with his father's death, and George II named him Prince of Wales a few weeks later. I think this is a portrait of George when he was about 16, about the time that he became Prince of Wales. And so George ascended to the British throne on October 25th, 1760, at the age of 22, when his grandfather suddenly died. And what does one do upon becoming king at the age of 22? You go out and you find a wife and you start having a lot of kids. George married Princess Sophia Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz in 1761, and by 1770 they had 6 children: George, Frederick, William, Charlotte, Edward, and Augusta. Eventually they would have a total of 15 children, the 3 youngest of which predeceased them. The life and reign of George III is enough for its own program, or honestly probably like 3 programs, so I will not get into too much more detail about his personal life, but I encourage you all to go out. There's some really good biographies that I will recommend at the end. But I will talk about George III and the American Revolution, because that's what we're all here for. So on August 23rd, 1775, after hearing about the Battle of Bunker Hill, George III released a proclamation for suppressing rebellion and sedition. Based on the title alone, how do you think he felt about the Americans at that point? Not great. The proclamation began, whereas many of our subjects in diverse parts of our colonies and plantations in North America, misled by dangerous and ill-designing men, and forgetting the allegiance which they owe to the power that has protected and sustained them, after various disorderly acts committed in the disturbance of the public peace, to the obstruction of lawful commerce, and to the oppression of our loyal subjects carrying on the same, have at length proceeded to an open and avowed rebellion, by arraying themselves in hostile manner to withstand the execution of the law, and traitorously preparing, ordering, and levying war against us. Keep in mind, Congress has not yet declared independence from Great Britain. Most people at this point thought that tensions would ease, or at least on the part of the Americans, and their demands for representation in Parliament and the repeal of the Intolerable Acts would be met, and then they would get to carry on with their lives happily as British citizens. Highlighting this belief on the part of the Americans was the Olive Branch Petition, which was adopted by Congress on July 5th, 1775. Shows you how much can happen in a year. In it, the members of the Second Continental Congress asked George III personally to avoid further conflict by repealing the Intolerable Acts, and affirmed American loyalty to Great Britain and the Crown, as they hoped for a lasting settlement between Great Britain and the colonies upon so firm a basis as to perpetuate its blessings, uninterrupted by any future dissensions to succeeding generations in both countries. A copy was presented to Colonial Secretary Lord Dartmouth in London on August 21st, and the original on September 1st. On September 2nd, the Americans who had delivered the petition were told that, as His Majesty did not receive it on the throne, no answer would be given. George actually refused to even read it, since the petition was viewed as insincere, since Congress had also passed the Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms the very day after they drafted the Olive Branch petition, and a letter from Congressman John Adams was intercepted by British officials in which he said himself that the petition served no purpose, as war with Britain was inevitable. Then, a few months later, on October 27th, George made his way to address both houses of Parliament in a speech from the throne. This image is actually from an address that George III gave in Parliament before 1775, in like the 1760s, but the fanfare that you see is appropriate for the period and is a good visual of, the crowds going out to meet him, the pomp and circumstance, etc. In the speech, he once again declares the American colonies in open rebellion and announces his intention to not just send the British Army and Navy to quash the rebellion, but to hire additional Hessian soldiers to supplement his troops. He also expresses how eager he was to avoid war, saying that, "I have acted with the same temper, anxious to prevent, if it had been possible, the effusion of the blood of my subjects, and the calamities which are inseparable from a state of war, still hoping that my people in America would have discerned the traitorous views of their leaders and have been convinced that to be a subject of Great Britain, with all its consequences, is to be the freest member of any civil society in the known world." And he wasn't lying. To be an American colonist in 1775 meant that you did in fact enjoy many more liberties than much of the rest of the world at that time, including other British colonies and even Britain itself. British soldiers, upon landing on Long Island in 1776, expressed that they could not believe how people who lived in a land of such bounty would even want to rebel. Despite outlining that he intended to use military force to suppress the rebellion, George concluded his remarks by leaving room for leniency. "When the unhappy and deluded multitude, against whom this force will be directed, shall become sensible of their error, I shall be ready to receive the misled with tenderness and mercy." How kind. And so there's an often misquoted statement from John Adams that the population was broken down into thirds over which side they fell on during the American Revolution. A third patriots, a third loyalists, and a third of everybody else. But he's actually referring to the French Revolution when he made that statement during his presidency in 1815. So that isn't very helpful necessarily for understanding the American Revolution. Modern estimates suggest that about 20% of the white population or 16% of the total population were Tories who either fought or worked for the British or went into exile. But to know how many people that actually was, you have to actually know what the population of America was during that time, and census records don't exactly exist from then. Estimates put total American population as low as 2,205,000 and as high as 2,789,400. If we say 20% were loyalists, there may have been as few as 410,000 loyalists or as many as 556,000 loyalists. And these numbers don't really take into consideration the number of Black loyalists or Native American loyalists who allied with the British during the war, which further complicates the issue of figuring out who was loyal and how many of them were there. Based on those numbers, however, it's obvious that being a loyalist wasn't uncommon, and I can guarantee everyone here has heard of at least one loyalist. So here are some famous American loyalists from Massachusetts that you would probably know about. Can anyone name one of them? And I guarantee if you make your best guess, you will get one.
John Quincy Adams?
Nope.
Thomas Jefferson?
Nope. So they'd be loyalists. Who would have been loyal to the British?
Benjamin Franklin's son.
Yeah, I will talk about Benjamin Franklin. What was the other one?
Benjamin Franklin, she said.
No, Benjamin Franklin's son was a loyalist, but anybody heard of Benedict Arnold?
Yeah.
Yeah, so
Which one is he?
that's Benedict Arnold in 1776. So he eventually became a loyalist because he was super dissatisfied with the way he was being treated by the American military. The second one is Dr. Benjamin Church, who was the first Surgeon General of the United States Army and who was active in Boston's Sons of Liberty before being outed and tried as a spy for Thomas Gage early in the war. And then the third one is the last royal governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, who basically got chased out of the state and was forced to return to England. But there were loyalists throughout the colonies, and often families and friends were divided on the issue. The tutor of George Washington's stepson was a loyalist. Benjamin Franklin's son, William, was a loyalist. John Singleton Copley, famous Boston painter for both Patriots and Tories, was a loyalist. Timothy Ruggles, Massachusetts politician and militia leader who served as president of the Stamp Act Congress, was a loyalist. And thanks to a 1884 article in Bay State Monthly by Henry Stedman Norris, historian for Lancaster, we have details on the more notable loyalists that were living in Lancaster during that time. I can pretty confidently say that there were more loyalists in Lancaster than just these people, but they probably kept their opinions to themselves, and so they didn't end up on a list because they weren't publicly caught doing anything. So first things first, Clark Chandler is described by Norse as a dapper little bachelor about 32 years of age, eccentric in person, habits, and dress. Apparently, I don't know how Norse found this out, but he was partial to bright red underwear. I had to read that, and now you have to know that, and we all have to live with that fact. But yeah, he was town clerk of Worcester in 1774 and recorded a protest of Tory citizens against the patriotic majority. He was forced to deface his notation in public meeting, and when he didn't render it sufficiently illegible with a pen, his tormentors dipped his finger into the ink and used them to obliterate it. He fled to Halifax, Nova Scotia for a few months before returning, but was caught and thrown in jail. As a lot of them were. A doctor's note from Josiah Wilder saw his release from jail so that he may visit Boston and to wander at will within the bounds of Worcester County for his health. And he eventually died in 1804. Joseph Wilder Jr. was a judge and got into trouble for being one of the signers of a Tory address to General Thomas Gage. After apologizing at the urging of the Committee of Safety, he did not get into further trouble and died 2 years into the war. Joseph House fled to Boston, and when the British abandoned the city in March 1776, he went with the army to Halifax. Unlike Joseph Wilder Jr., he did not have extensive land holdings in Lancaster, and his name, along with Abijah and Abel Willard, who I will speak about momentarily, appear in the Massachusetts Banishment Act of 1778, which was an act to prevent the return to this state of certain persons therein named and others who have left this state or either of the United States and joined the enemies thereof. The punishment for returning was death. So Massachusetts made it very clear that they had no interest in allowing any known Tories back into the state once they'd left, and they were happy to have it that way. Nasham Houghton got into trouble when Lancaster's Committee of Correspondence published in July 1775 that he was an unwearied peddler of that baneful herb tea, and the committee warned all patriots to entirely shun his company and have no manner of dealings or connections with him except acts of common humanity. At special town meeting on June 30th, 1777, Colonel Asa Whitcomb of Lancaster, who served in the provincial army at Lexington and Concord and during the siege of Boston, was chosen to collect evidence against suspected loyalists, which included Moses Garish, Daniel Allen, Ezra Houghton, Joseph Moore, and Solomon Houghton, all of whom were voted as dangerous persons and internal enemies to this state. Thomas Grant had served in the French and Indian War, and if he was in fact a loyalist, avoided getting into further trouble by enlisting in the Continental Army. That's one way to avoid wrath. As his name is on a Rhode Island muster roll in 1777, and he was mustered again in 1781. Enoch Garish was a farmer who left his home, was arrested and imprisoned in York County in what is probably the county in southern Maine, and then returned to Worcester for trial. Moses Garish, perhaps Enoch's brother, eventually received a commissary position in the British Army, and at the end of the war obtained a land grant of free tenancy on an island in New Brunswick. Solomon Houghton was also a farmer of considerable circumstances, but fearing the Patriots fled his home, which was confiscated in 1779, as it was very common for Patriots to confiscate Loyalist land and homes. Ezra Houghton was Justice of the Peace and had signed his name to the Tory address to Gage in 1775, which he was forced to recant. In May 1777, he was imprisoned under charges of counterfeiting and aiding the enemy. His bail bond was set at £2,000, which is a lot of money, especially in 1775. Joseph Moore was one of the 6 slave owners in Lancaster in 1771 and possessed a farm and a mill. He too was jailed in Worcester in September of 1777 and asked to be released because he claimed innocence. But his petition was ignored and his estate was confiscated anyway. James Carter and Daniel Allen both had their names stricken from the blacklist in November of 1777 at a town meeting, apparently without opposition, so they were able to clear their good names. And then Reverend Timothy Harrington is a name that might be a bit of surprise to see on a list of Lancaster loyalists, but he got into a bit of trouble for making certain incautious expressions of opinion, but appears really to have been inspired by the spite of the Whitcombs and others, whose enmity had been aroused by his conservative actions several years before in the church troubles, known as the Goss and Whalley War in the neighboring town of Bolton. Basically, the man in charge of rooting out loyalists in Lancaster didn't really like Reverend Harrington and sort of used it as an excuse to put his name on the list and kind of damage his reputation. His name was eventually removed from the list, supposedly after confronting his accusers, baring his breast and exclaiming with the language and feelings of outraged virtue, "Strike here with your daggers, I am a true friend of my country." A big display like that is usually going to get you out of whatever trouble you're in. And so that brings us to the most prominent Lancaster loyalists, the Willard family. They were descendants of Major Simon Willard, who was among Lancaster's first settlers and had served in King Philip's War. By 1775, at the start of the American Revolution, the 3 great-grandsons of Simon, Abijah, 51, Levi, 48, and Abel, 44, were also some of Lancaster's wealthiest citizens. According to Norse, these 3 gentlemen had large possession in land, were widely known throughout the province, and they were held in deserved esteem for their probity and ability. They were all royalists at heart and all connected by marriage with royalist families. The middle brother, Levi, had been a tax collector for Worcester County as well as a justice of the peace. He and his brother-in-law, Samuel Ward, ran a very successful mercantile business in Worcester, importing British goods, and he had even traveled to England. He suffered from illness throughout his life, and when the war broke out, he was too ill to take a side despite his loyalist sympathies, and he died July 11th, 1775. His son Levi Jr., however, fled to England where he remained until 1785, at which point he returned home to Lancaster. The youngest of the brothers was Abel Willard, who chose the art of peace rather than the arts of war, as his brothers had done. He graduated from Harvard in 1752 and was ranked 3rd in his class and was a personal friend of John Adams. Norse writes that so popular was Abel Willard and so well known his character as a peacemaker and a well-wisher to his country that he might have remained unmolested and respected among his neighbors in spite of his royalist opinions. But whether led by family ties or natural timidity, he sought refuge in Boston, and quick coming events made it impossible for him to return to Lancaster. He was listed along with his brother Abijah and Joseph House in the Massachusetts Banishment Act, and he died in England in 1781. Last but certainly not least is Abijah Willard, who is probably Lancaster's most famous loyalist. He had served in the French and Indian War and by age of 21 had earned the rank of captain and was eventually promoted to colonel. Norse describes him as a thorough soldier, a gentleman of stately presence and dignified manners, and a skillful manager of affairs. He was the wealthiest citizen of Lancaster at the time and kept 6 horses in his stables and dispensed liberal hospitality in the mansion inherited from his father. He was appointed a mandamus counselor in 1774, which wasn't a popular position to be in at that time, as the position was granted to friends of the crown. And while in Connecticut on business, he was arrested, and a mob of 500 persons accompanied him over the state line, intending to convey him to the nearest jail. But after walking 6 miles, or because Abijah was quite charming, they released him in Sturbridge and after forcing him to sign a paper promising to leave the position, which was subsequently published in the Boston Gazette, which this is a scan of that newspaper and the statement that Abijah had to make. Abijah Willard minded his own business at home in Lancaster after that, or at least until April 19th, 1775. The story goes that when setting out in the morning on horseback to visit his farm in Beverly, where he had planned to spend some days in superintending the planting, he was turned from his course by the swarming out of Minutemen at the summons of the couriers bringing the alarm from Lexington. And we next find him with the British in Boston. We find Abijah again in Boston on June 17th, 1775, where he is standing atop Copp's Hill looking across the harbor at Charlestown, where the Patriots have constructed a redoubt on Breed's Hill. Abijah was standing with British officers, including General Gage, and as he looked across the hill, recognized the commander of the Patriot forces as his brother-in-law, William Prescott, who himself was a descendant of John Prescott, the founder of Lancaster. Lancaster is like the center of the universe, I swear. General Gage asks Abijah who commands the American redoubt. Willard responds, Colonel Prescott. Gage asks him, will he fight? Abijah answers either by saying yes to the last drop of his blood, or more passionately, Prescott will fight you to the gates of hell. North reports that after this, Abijah Willard was offered a colonel's commission in the British Army due to his reputation as a soldier during the French and Indian War. But he refused and instead went to Halifax when the British abandoned Boston in 1776, along with Abel Willard and their families. He would later join the British in Long Island and was appointed as a commissary officer, and supposedly he saved the crown thousands of pounds due to his fine management skills there. In 1783, he requested a land grant in Nova Scotia as compensation for the losses of his estate during the war, and named the town that he settled Lancaster in remembrance of his birthplace, which he never returned to. Members of his family eventually returned to Lancaster after his death in 1789, however, and they were able to recover the confiscated estate. What went on in Lancaster with various loyalists who resided here was largely the same throughout the rest of the colonies. Although, as far as I'm aware, violence did not break out between Patriots and Tories in Lancaster like it did in a lot of other places. The experiences of the Willards and other loyalists were not unique to Lancaster either. A lot of them were jailed. A lot of them were pressured into signing things that they didn't necessarily believe or want to. And all of them hoped, as all British loyalists did, that the war would quickly be won and that their lives would return to normal. But since we are all currently gathered in the United States of America and not the British American colonies, I think you can guess how the war turned out. The British were hopeful that they would come out victorious throughout the war, but by the time Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown, the war had become largely unpopular and the North Ministry collapsed, leading to our friend Freddie to resign and Charlie to become Prime Minister. In another speech from the throne on December 5th, 1782, George III was finally forced to acknowledge American independence and announced that peace negotiations were underway. However, he expressed sincere hope that the two countries would remain close, a sentiment he repeated to the First Minister to London, John Adams, 3 years later in 1785, when he held an audience with him. And I see fitting to end the program with the King's words. So this is what he said to John Adams. I wish you, sir, to believe that it may be understood in America that I have done nothing in the late contest but what I thought myself indispensably bound to do, by the duty which I owed to my people. I will be very frank with you. I was the last to consent to the separation, but the separation having been made and having become inevitable, I have always said, as I say now, that I would be the first to meet the friendship of the United States as an independent power. Let the circumstances of language, religion, and blood have their natural and full effect. And that's George in 1785, so that's roughly what he would have looked like when he met John Adams and said these things, which is kind of fun. And so in terms of resources to go out and learn, Lancaster-specific ones are always Abijah Marvin's The History of the Town of Lancaster, Marion Safford's The Story of Colonial Lancaster, and then specifically for loyalists, Henry Norse's article in Bay State Monthly from 1884. It's available online. in its complete form through like archive.org, I think, and so it's very legible. More generally, I would recommend Thomas Allen's Tories to learn more about loyalists and Tories throughout the American colonies during this time. Maya Jasanoff's Liberty's Exiles, American Loyalists in the Revolutionary World. And then for King George specifically, Andrew Roberts' The Last King of America, The Misunderstood Reign of George III. Yes, Phil.
Okay, when the British conquered Canada from the 70 Years' War,
Yep.
did they have the same issue with rebels and revolts? Because where I'm going is, as Canada became a sort of a member of a Commonwealth of Nations under the UK, couldn't the English have negotiated some kind of similar arrangement?
Yeah, so there were loyalists and also patriots in Canada at that time. Congress tried very unsuccessfully to invade Canada very early on in the war. It didn't go well. Benedict Arnold was there. It all fell apart very quickly. But once the capture of Montreal and Quebec became a very, obviously, it wasn't going to work out. All of the most of the patriots from those regions came into the American colonies, so into what is today Maine, which is why you find populations of French speakers in Maine, because they're from French Canada. And then, and also into New York, because New York was the other big area. But that also meant that a lot of Tories in the United States fled into Canada. Just Halifax and New Brunswick was where a lot of them went to. But a lot of them fled into. So there was this big exchange of both patriots and Tories as the different populations fled those areas. And loyalists from the Americas and British officers were actually recruiting people in Canada to fight on the British side in order to squash the rebellion. So it's all very complicated. There's a lot of people moving around and like going here, there, and everywhere. And so it's tricky, but yeah.
Do you have an idea of what the population in Canada was at the time?
No.
Probably was nowhere near.
No, it wouldn't, because I think the main settlements in Canada at that point would have been Quebec and Montreal. They're kind of, which was on the St. Lawrence. There wouldn't really have been many other major cities at that time. So it would have been a smaller population compared to the colonies, just because spacing wise, and you have, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, etc. Any other questions? No? Maybe?
Do you have an idea why George wanted to get the Hessians involved from the beginning?
So the Hessians were like,
Professionals.
they were professionals. They were paid to be good. And, having a standing army was something Britain was very good at, but that didn't mean, and they were very good at doing their drills and like all of that, but that didn't mean they had actually seen battle. And so a lot of the soldiers, the British soldiers that came over to Long Island, that was the first time they had ever been in battle. Whereas when you have the Hessians, they've been there, they've done that, they know what they're doing, they're very scary. They will go in and basically take care of things relatively quickly. And since George was also King of Hanover, he had the authority to be able to say, yeah, I'm pulling in German troops basically in order to supplement it. But yes, he did have to pay the Hessians for it.
And did the Hessians come over in British ships? Or did
Yes.
Okay.
I think they would have most likely traveled from Germany to the UK, and then they would have all come over together. George was the first of the Hanoverian kings to be born in Great Britain and speak English as his first language. Both his father and his grandfather were born in Germany and did not speak English as a first language. So much to consider about that. Well, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it.